The Derbent Iron Gate. In 627 AD, as the Sasanian Empire struggled against Byzantine forces, a lesser-known frontier alarm was raised along the western shores of the Caspian Sea. Scouts reported movement across the northern steppes. Mounted warriors had descended from the Caucasus, probing for weakness. Yet when they reached the narrow corridor between mountain and sea, they halted. Before them stood a barrier that seemed less like architecture and more like a deliberate geological obstruction. It was not simply a wall. It was a choke point engineered to strangle entire migrations. And for centuries, armies approaching from the north would confront the same realization. This was not a fortress meant to be attacked. It was a gate meant to end invasions before they began. The Derbent Fortress, often called the Iron Gate, stretches from the foothills of the Caucasus Mountains down toward the Caspian shoreline. Twin stone walls once ran nearly 2 miles inland, sealing the narrowest passage between Europe and Asia. Each wall rose approximately 30 feet high and measured nearly 10 feet thick in some sections. Towers punctuated the length at strategic intervals, creating overlapping fields of missile fire. The construction was not ornamental. It was tactical geometry carved into the landscape. The walls did not simply block passage. They funneled movement into confined lanes, forcing any advancing force into exposed bottlenecks, where cavalry lost mobility and infantry compressed into lethal density. Archaeological surveys reveal that the stone blocks were fitted with remarkable precision. Mortar seams remain intact after more than 1,400 years of weather exposure. Beneath the visible walls lay subterranean passages and storage chambers capable of sustaining a garrison through extended sieges. Water channels diverted mountain runoff into internal reservoirs. Grain silos were embedded within defensive sectors. Derbent was not designed for short resistance. It was designed to endure. Historical accounts from Arab chroniclers describe nomadic confederations turning back rather than attempt prolonged assault, not because the fortress was unconquerable, but because the cost of breaking it would cripple momentum. An army stalled at Derbent risked starvation, exposure, and encirclement from rear forces. The Iron Gate did not need to win battles. It needed only to delay them. Over centuries, empires reinforced and expanded the complex. Sasanian engineers laid the foundation. Arab rulers strengthened the towers. Persian dynasties repaired breaches. Russian forces later occupied and modernized segments. Yet the core structure remained unchanged. The location itself was the weapon. Satellite mapping confirms that the corridor it seals is barely wide enough in places to support large-scale maneuvering. Remove Derbent, and the Caucasus becomes permeable. Leave it standing, and entire migrations funnel elsewhere. Despite its strategic weight, Derbent rarely features prominently in mainstream military narratives. Campaign histories emphasize decisive clashes, not the barriers that prevented them. Archival military correspondence from later Russian administrations, referencing reinforcement strategies for the corridor, remain partially restricted. Excavation permits in certain sections of the wall have been denied under preservation statutes. Photographic surveys conducted during the Cold War were reportedly archived without full publication. If Derbent had failed in its early centuries, waves of steppe expansion may have poured directly into the Middle East uninterrupted. Trade routes would have shifted, religious frontiers might have fractured, political centers could have fallen centuries earlier than recorded. The Iron Gate stands not as a monument to a single victory, but to countless wars that never ignited, because commanders understood the arithmetic of stone and geography. A fortress does not always need to be attacked to shape history. Sometimes its mere presence redraws the map. The Alamut Castle. In 1090, a traveler moving through the rugged mountains of northern Persia reported seeing torchlight burning high above the clouds. The flames did not belong to a village or caravan camp. They came from a fortress perched atop a narrow rock ridge more than 6,000 feet above sea level. From below, the structure appeared fused to the mountain itself. Its cliffs dropped almost vertically into dark valleys filled with fog and broken stone. Local guides refused to approach after sunset. Some claimed the men inside could reach a target hundreds of miles away without ever leaving the mountain. Others whispered that rulers feared the fortress more than entire armies. What stood above those cliffs was Alamut Castle, and for nearly 2 centuries, it became one of the most psychologically terrifying strongholds in the medieval world. The fortress occupied an almost impossible position. Built along a razor-thin ridge in the Alborz Mountains, Alamut controlled only one practical access route, a winding path barely wide enough for mounted riders to travel in single file. Any advancing force had to climb through exposed switchbacks, while defenders observed every movement from above. Stone walls merged directly into the cliff edges, eliminating weak points that siege engines could exploit. Unlike many fortresses of the era, Alamut did not rely on size. It relied on isolation, elevation, and control. Archaeological reconstruction suggests the castle complex included hidden storage chambers, underground cisterns, granaries, and internal gardens capable of supporting long-term survival during siege conditions. Water channels carved directly into rock collected snowmelt from the mountains and distributed it throughout the compound. Even if surrounded, the defenders could outlast armies trapped below in hostile terrain. Excavated remains indicate that portions of the fortress were terraced into multiple defensive layers, forcing attackers to fight uphill through confined kill zones under constant missile fire. Yet the true power of Alamut was not physical, it was psychological. The fortress became headquarters of the Nizari Ismailis under Hassan I Saba, whose followers would later become known in Western accounts as the Assassins. Medieval chronicles describe rulers receiving threats from unseen operatives linked to the mountain fortress. Some accounts claim enemy commanders awoke to find daggers planted beside their beds as warnings. Whether exaggerated or not, the effect was devastating. Fear spread far beyond the walls themselves. Armies began treating Alamut less like a military target and more like the center of an invisible network capable of striking anywhere. Seljuk forces repeatedly attempted to neutralize the stronghold, but hesitated to launch direct assaults. Commanders understood the nightmare of mountain warfare against defenders who knew every ridge and canyon. Supply lines stretched thin across dangerous terrain. Siege towers were useless on steep slopes. Heavy cavalry became dead weight. Even victory promised catastrophic losses. Persian manuscripts recovered centuries later describe Alamut as a fortress above reason. And some records referencing its internal libraries claim the complex housed scientific texts, astronomical studies, and encrypted correspondence networks spanning multiple kingdoms. When Mongol forces under Hulagu Khan finally moved against Alamut in the 13th century, they did so with overwhelming manpower and a systematic campaign designed to erase every associated stronghold simultaneously. Even then, contemporary records suggest commanders feared prolonged resistance from the mountain network. After the Mongol conquest, much of the fortress was dismantled. Libraries were reportedly burned, documents vanished. Sections of the site collapsed down the mountainside over time. Modern excavation efforts remain limited due to instability and restricted access zones. Some historians argue that surviving records of Alamut were deliberately distorted by its enemies, making it difficult to separate propaganda from reality. Yet the consistent pattern across sources remains impossible to ignore. Entire rulers altered behavior because of the fortress looming above the clouds. Alamut proved that the most dangerous strongholds are not always the largest. Sometimes the fortress no army wants to attack is the one that convinces the enemy they are vulnerable long before the battle even begins. The Krak Des Chevaliers. In 1188, after capturing several Crusader strongholds across the Levant, Sultan Saladin approached a fortress overlooking the mountain passes of western Syria. His armies had already shattered kingdoms, broken fortified cities, and reclaimed territory once considered permanently lost to the Crusaders. Yet when his commanders surveyed the massive stone complex rising above the surrounding hills, hesitation spread through the camp. The walls seemed impossibly thick. Towers overlapped at angles that eliminated blind spots. Every approach route climbed through exposed terrain with almost no natural cover. Saladin studied the structure from a distance, calculated the cost of assault, and made a decision that stunned many of his officers. He bypassed it. That fortress was Krak Des Chevaliers, one of the most formidable military structures ever built in the medieval world. Originally constructed by Kurdish forces before being expanded by the Knights Hospitaller during the Crusades, Krak Des Chevaliers occupied a strategic ridge controlling routes between the Mediterranean coast and inland Syria. The fortress dominated the surrounding valleys from an elevation of nearly 2,100 feet, allowing defenders to detect approaching armies long before they reached striking distance. But location alone did not make Krak terrifying. Its architecture transformed it into a machine designed specifically to break sieges. The outer wall formed the first defensive ring, reinforced with massive rounded towers capable of deflecting incoming projectiles. Behind it stood an even larger inner fortress rising above the outer defenses like a second citadel. Any army breaching the outer perimeter would find itself trapped between walls, while defenders rained arrows, stones, and burning pitch from elevated positions. Engineers built narrow entry corridors that twisted sharply, preventing battering rams from gaining momentum. Murder holes above the gates allowed defenders to attack anyone trapped below with boiling liquids and heavy debris. Excavations reveal storage capacity far beyond normal fortress requirements. Vast vaulted halls held grain, salted meat, olive oil, and wine reserves capable of feeding thousands for years. Massive cisterns collected rainwater from rooftops and internal channels. Even prolonged isolation failed to weaken the defenders quickly. Krak was not built merely to resist assault. It was built to survive abandonment. Contemporary Muslim chroniclers described the fortress as nearly untouchable, without overwhelming force and extensive preparation. Some siege estimates suggested attackers would lose tens of thousands of men before even reaching the inner walls. The surrounding terrain worsened the problem. Open slopes exposed advancing troops to continuous missile fire, while siege engines struggled across rocky ground. Defenders stationed at elevated towers could strike targets at multiple angles simultaneously, creating overlapping kill zones that turned the hillside into a slaughter field. Even psychologically, Krak projected invulnerability. Travelers described its pale limestone walls glowing under moonlight like a mountain carved into geometric form. The fortress could be seen for miles across the region, acting as a permanent reminder that Crusader power still watched the valleys below. For enemy armies marching through Syria, the site alone carried strategic weight. When Mamluk Sultan Baybars eventually captured Krak Des Chevaliers in 1271, he did not rely solely on brute force. Historical records indicate he used deception, presenting forged letters allegedly ordering the garrison to surrender. Whether the defenders truly believed the documents remains debated, but the method itself reveals an important truth. Even one of the most powerful military leaders of the era preferred manipulation over direct assault. Following its fall, the fortress remained largely intact, because destroying it completely would have required enormous effort. Many original defensive systems survive to this day, including vaulted corridors, towers, and reinforced gate complexes. Military historians still study Krak Des Chevaliers as one of the purest examples of layered defensive engineering ever created. Its legacy extends beyond the Crusades. Krak demonstrated that a fortress could become more than a barrier. It could become a calculation so costly that entire armies reconsidered war itself. The Masada Fortress. In 72 AD, under the burning desert sun near the Dead Sea, Roman scouts stood at the base of an enormous plateau, rising nearly 1,300 feet above the surrounding wilderness. At its summit, barely visible against the sky, stood a fortress unlike anything they had encountered in Judea. The cliffs surrounding it were almost completely vertical. Narrow pathways twisted upward through exposed rock, where a handful of defenders could hold back hundreds of soldiers. Roman commanders quickly realized the truth. This would not be a conventional siege. To take the fortress above them, they would have to fight the mountain itself. That mountain stronghold was Masada. Originally fortified by King Herod the Great decades earlier, Masada occupied an isolated mesa overlooking one of the harshest landscapes in the ancient world. The plateau stretched approximately 1,800 feet long and 900 feet wide, surrounded on nearly every side by sheer rock faces that plunged into desert terrain below. From a distance, the summit appeared inaccessible. That illusion was intentional. Every aspect of Masada's construction exploited geography as a weapon. Archaeological evidence shows the fortress contained massive storerooms packed with preserved grain, dried fruit, olive oil, and wine. Deep cistern systems carved directly into stone collected seasonal floodwaters from nearby wadis and stored enough water to sustain inhabitants for years. Excavators uncovered sophisticated bathhouses, barracks, armories, and workshops integrated into the summit itself. Masada was not designed as a temporary refuge. It was engineered as a final redoubt, capable of surviving complete isolation. The only practical ascent routes were narrow snake-like trails hugging the cliffs. Attackers climbing them would remain exposed for most of the ascent, while defenders fired arrows, hurled stones, or rolled debris downward. Roman siege towers and battering rams became nearly useless against such elevation. Heavy infantry struggled under the heat. Equipment had to be hauled uphill across unforgiving terrain, where temperatures regularly exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit. After the First Jewish Revolt, a group of Jewish rebels known as the Sigiriya retreated to Masada and transformed it into their last stronghold against Rome. The empire responded with overwhelming force. The 10th Legion surrounded the mountain, constructing camps and a massive circumvallation wall to prevent escape. Yet even Rome, the greatest military machine of the ancient world, could not storm the fortress directly. Instead, Roman engineers undertook one of the most extraordinary siege operations in history. Over months of brutal labor, thousands of soldiers and slaves built an enormous assault ramp against the western side of the plateau using stone, earth, and timber. The structure gradually climbed toward the summit, allowing siege engines to approach the walls. Even today, remnants of the ramp remain visible from the air, a scar across the desert left by an empire forced to reshape the landscape itself, simply to reach its enemy. Ancient historian Josephus described the siege as psychologically exhausting for Roman troops. Every day the fortress still stood became an embarrassment to imperial authority. The rebels above watched the slow advance from the cliffs, while Roman forces baked under desert conditions below. Disease, exhaustion, and supply strain spread through the camps. Masada had become more than a military objective. It had become a symbol of resistance towering over Rome's pride. When Roman forces finally breached the defenses, they reportedly discovered silence. According to historical accounts, most of the defenders chose death rather than capture. Whether every detail of the story is accurate remains debated among historians, but the impact of Masada endured across centuries. Modern surveys reveal how astonishingly difficult direct assault would have been without the Roman ramp. The plateau's natural defenses remain intimidating even today. Helicopter footage shows cliffs dropping almost vertically into barren desert, while the summit commands unrestricted visibility for miles in every direction. Masada proved that some fortresses do not rely solely on walls. They rely on isolation, endurance, and the terrifying realization that conquering them may cost more than victory itself is worth. The Mehrangarh Fort. In 1808, as rival Rajput clans and regional armies maneuvered across the deserts of Rajasthan, a military observer traveling with a Maratha column recorded an unsettling reaction among veteran soldiers approaching the city of Jodhpur. Long before the fortress came fully into view, conversations in the camp began to quiet. Men pointed toward a dark shape rising above the desert cliffs, like a stone storm cloud frozen in place. Some commanders advised avoiding direct engagement altogether. Others argued that besieging the fortress would consume entire seasons and bleed resources dry. When the army finally reached visual range, the reason became obvious. The fortress did not stand beside the landscape. It dominated it completely. Mehrangarh Fort rises approximately 400 feet above the city of Jodhpur, atop a massive outcrop of volcanic rock. From below, its walls appear to grow directly from the cliff face itself, in some places blending so perfectly with the stone that attackers struggled to distinguish natural terrain from defensive structure. The outer ramparts towered up to 120 feet high and measured as much as 70 feet thick in critical sectors. Even artillery introduced centuries later often failed to produce decisive breaches. Unlike many medieval fortresses built around straight entry paths, Mehrangarh weaponized movement itself. Approaching armies could not simply charge the gates. The ascent wound through a narrow uphill route filled with sharp turns, confined passages, and elevated kill zones. Massive gates reinforced with iron spikes blocked each segment of the climb. Those spikes served a specific purpose, stopping war elephants from smashing through the entrances. Any attacking force attempting to advance uphill would lose formation almost immediately while defenders attacked from hidden angles above. Historical battle accounts describe how archers, musketeers, and artillery crews stationed along the walls could fire downward into tightly compressed enemy columns. Some gateways were deliberately offset so battering rams could not build momentum. Others forced attackers to expose their unshielded sides while turning corners under fire. The higher invading soldiers climbed, the more vulnerable they became. Inside the fortress lay an entirely self-sustaining military complex. Deep wells tapped underground water reserves. Granaries stored enough supplies to endure lengthy sieges. Internal courtyards allowed defenders to reposition troops rapidly between sectors while remaining protected from external bombardment. Hidden passageways connected towers and defensive stations across multiple levels. Excavations reveal layered construction phases spanning centuries, with each ruling dynasty reinforcing weaknesses identified during previous conflicts. But Mehrangarh's greatest weapon may have been visibility. From the summit, defenders could observe movement across vast sections of the surrounding Thar Desert. Dust clouds from approaching armies became visible long before enemy forces arrived. This early warning advantage allowed the fortress to prepare for attack days in advance, while hostile troops exhausted themselves, crossing harsh terrain under brutal heat. Several invading powers attempted to subdue Mehrangarh over the centuries, including Mughal emperors and rival Rajput kingdoms. Some succeeded temporarily through political manipulation or negotiated surrender. Very few achieved decisive victory through straightforward assault. Even cannon warfare struggled against the fortress because the elevated position disrupted firing angles. Heavy siege artillery transported through desert conditions often arrived depleted, overheated, or vulnerable to counterattacks before bombardment could begin effectively. European travelers during the colonial era described the fortress with a mixture of admiration and dread. One British officer wrote that attacking Mehrangarh felt less like fighting an army and more like challenging the mountain itself. The psychological effect mattered. Soldiers forced to climb uphill toward towering walls under direct fire often broke morale before reaching the gates. Modern structural analysis confirms how intelligently the fort was integrated into the geology beneath it. Sections of the cliff were deliberately carved to create steeper gradients, while natural fractures in the rock were reinforced into defensive barriers. The result was not simply architecture placed upon a hill, it was terrain transformed into a permanent military weapon. Mehrangarh demonstrated a brutal truth understood by experienced commanders across centuries. A fortress does not become feared merely because it is strong. It becomes feared when every step toward it feels mathematically hopeless. The Bam Citadel. In 1722, as Afghan forces swept across Persia during the collapse of the Safavid Empire, military couriers carried alarming reports from the eastern deserts. Entire settlements had fallen within days. Caravan routes were burning. Refugees fled westward through dust storms and shattered trade roads. Yet, amid the chaos, one stronghold remained untouched. Rising from the barren edge of the Lut Desert stood a massive fortress city built almost entirely from earth-colored clay. From a distance, it looked less like a man-made structure and more like a mirage emerging from the sand itself. Invading commanders studied the citadel carefully and hesitated. Assaulting the fortress meant more than fighting defenders behind walls. It meant surviving the desert long enough to reach them. That fortress was Bam Citadel, known historically as Arg-e-Bam. Located along ancient Silk Road trade corridors in southeastern Iran, Bam Citadel covered nearly 450,000 square feet, making it one of the largest adobe fortress complexes ever constructed. Unlike isolated castles designed purely for military defense, Bam functioned as a fully fortified city. Massive outer walls surrounded residential districts, military barracks, stables, markets, workshops, mosques, and command towers arranged in ascending defensive layers. At the highest point stood the governor's compound, protected behind additional walls overlooking the entire settlement below. Its appearance concealed extraordinary engineering. The fortress was constructed primarily from compacted mud brick and straw-reinforced clay, materials perfectly adapted to the surrounding environment. Thick earthen walls absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly at night, stabilizing internal temperatures against desert extremes. More importantly, those same walls resisted many forms of siege damage. Cannonballs often buried themselves into adobe surfaces without producing catastrophic fragmentation. Unlike stone fortifications that shattered violently under artillery impact, Bam's walls absorbed punishment like compressed earth embankments. But the true nightmare for attackers lay outside the walls. The surrounding desert acted as an invisible defensive perimeter extending for miles. Summer temperatures frequently surpassed 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Water sources were scarce and tightly controlled. Armies attempting prolonged siege operations faced dehydration, supply collapse, and exposure long before defenders inside the fortress weakened. Bam's internal connaught system, an underground network of water channels, carried groundwater into the citadel from distant aquifers, while remaining protected from sabotage. Even if external wells were cut off, the city could continue functioning beneath the surface. Approach routes into the fortress were equally deceptive. Narrow corridors twisted between elevated walls and dense urban sectors designed to disorient invaders unfamiliar with the layout. Archers stationed on rooftops and towers could fire downward into confined streets where cavalry became useless, and infantry formations collapsed into chaos. Historical Persian accounts describe sections of the city intentionally designed as defensive mazes, forcing attackers into layered ambush zones if outer gates were breached. Trade also contributed to Bam's survival. Positioned along lucrative caravan routes connecting Persia, Central Asia, and the Indian subcontinent, the fortress accumulated wealth capable of sustaining large garrisons and long-term storage reserves. Merchants traveling through the region often described Bam as untouchable, not because no army could attack it, but because any invading force risked destroying itself, maintaining the siege. Several regional powers occupied or contested Bam over the centuries, yet records of direct catastrophic assault remain surprisingly limited considering the fortress's strategic importance. Some military historians believe commanders deliberately avoided large-scale engagement there whenever alternatives existed. The environmental cost simply outweighed the reward. Even modern analysis reinforces this reputation. Before the devastating 2003 earthquake that severely damaged the structure, satellite imaging revealed how intelligently Bam blended into the desert terrain. Its earth-toned architecture reduced visibility from distance, while elevated towers monitored movement across surrounding plains for miles. Archaeologists examining surviving sectors continue to uncover concealed storage chambers and underground passageways, suggesting far greater defensive complexity than previously understood. Bam Citadel proved that some fortresses are protected not only by walls or soldiers, but by geography itself. The desert surrounding it became part of the defense system, slowly exhausting any force arrogant enough to believe numbers alone could conquer the sands. The Theodosian Walls. In 717 AD, as the massive armies of the Umayyad Caliphate surrounded Constantinople by land and sea, soldiers arriving at the front reportedly fell silent upon seeing the walls for the first time. Stretching across the western edge of the city like an artificial mountain range, the defenses rose layer upon layer against the horizon. Siege engines rolled forward through mud and smoke, while defenders watched from towers high above. The attackers had crossed continents, shattered kingdoms, and conquered some of the richest cities on earth. Yet standing before the walls of Constantinople, many realized they faced something different. This was not a fortress guarding a city. It was a defensive system built to stop empires themselves. Constructed during the reign of Emperor Theodosius II in the 5th century, the Theodosian Walls protected Constantinople for nearly 1,000 years. Running approximately 4 miles across the landward side of the city, the fortifications consisted of multiple defensive layers engineered with terrifying precision. A wide moat formed the first obstacle. Beyond it stood an outer wall lined with towers. Behind that rose the massive inner wall, reaching nearly 40 feet high and reinforced by towering defensive bastions spaced at regular intervals. The design transformed every assault into a nightmare of attrition. Attackers first had to cross exposed ground under constant missile fire while navigating trenches and muddy terrain. If they breached the outer wall, they entered a confined killing field, trapped between defensive layers, where archers and artillery crews attacked from elevated positions on both sides. Even successful penetration of one sector rarely mattered because defenders could seal passages and reposition reinforcements rapidly through internal corridors behind the walls. The engineering itself was centuries ahead of its time. Stone foundations anchored the walls deep into the earth, while alternating brick and limestone layers absorbed shock from earthquakes and siege impacts. Towers projected outward at strategic angles, eliminating blind spots and creating overlapping fields of fire. Archaeological studies suggest some towers contained internal supply rooms, allowing defenders to continue fighting, even if isolated from neighboring sectors. But perhaps the greatest strength of the walls was endurance. Constantinople possessed access to maritime resupply routes through the Bosporus and Golden Horn, allowing the city to survive sieges that would have starved most medieval capitals into surrender. Massive cistern systems beneath the city stored water reserves on an extraordinary scale. Granaries held emergency provisions capable of sustaining hundreds of thousands of inhabitants. As invading armies weakened outside the walls through disease, weather, and supply exhaustion, the city often remained operational behind its defenses. The list of armies stopped by the Theodosian Walls is staggering. Persians failed to break them. Arab sieges collapsed against them repeatedly. Rus invasions ended in retreat. Bulgar offensives stalled beneath the towers. Even when sections suffered damage from earthquakes or bombardment, repairs were often completed with astonishing speed before attackers could exploit weaknesses. Historical chronicles describe terrifying scenes during major sieges. Flaming projectiles arced through the sky, while naval assaults battered seawalls simultaneously. Defenders deployed Greek fire against enemy fleets, turning the surrounding waters into burning chaos. Yet, through centuries of warfare, the walls endured as the physical embodiment of imperial survival. The psychological impact became almost mythic. To medieval Europe and the Islamic world alike, Constantinople's walls represented the line between worlds. Travelers approaching the city often described feelings of disbelief at the scale of the fortifications. Some invading commanders reportedly abandoned assault plans entirely after calculating the projected casualties required for breach operations. It was not until 1453, with the arrival of massive Ottoman bombards under Sultan Mehmed II, that the walls finally fell after weeks of relentless artillery fire. Even then, sections continued resisting after catastrophic breaches appeared. The conquest shocked the world precisely because the walls had seemed nearly eternal. Modern military historians still regard the Theodosian Walls as one of the greatest defensive achievements in human history. Their survival across nearly a millennium altered trade routes, preserved empires, shaped religious boundaries, and delayed invasions that could have transformed Europe centuries earlier. The walls did not merely defend Constantinople. They held back the collapse of an entire civilization for almost 1,000 years. The Golconda Fort. In 1687, after months of failed assaults against the fortress of Golconda, Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb reportedly ordered his commanders to stop underestimating the structure rising above the Deccan Plateau. Thousands of soldiers had already been committed to the siege. Heavy cannons bombarded the walls day after day, yet the defenders continued responding with unnerving coordination. Reinforcements appeared at threatened sectors almost instantly. Ambushes erupted inside narrow approach corridors before attackers fully understood they had been detected. Rumors spread through the Mughal camps that the fortress could hear enemies approaching long before scouts ever sounded alarms. Exhausted soldiers began whispering that the walls themselves were listening. Golconda Fort, located near present-day Hyderabad in India, was one of the most sophisticated defensive strongholds of the medieval world. Unlike many fortresses that relied primarily on elevation or thick walls, Golconda weaponized information and communication. Every layer of the structure was engineered to detect movement, delay penetration, and coordinate defense with astonishing efficiency. The outer fortifications stretched across nearly 7 miles of defensive perimeter, reinforced with granite walls rising up to 35 feet high in some sectors. 8 massive gates controlled access into the complex, each protected by angled entrances, iron-reinforced barriers, and elevated firing positions. but the fortress's most unsettling feature was hidden in its acoustics. At the main entrance known as the Fateh Darwaza, a simple handclap beneath the gate's dome could reportedly be heard clearly at the Bala Hisar Pavilion, nearly 0.6 miles uphill at the highest point of the fortress. Modern acoustic testing confirms that the structure's vaulted chambers and stone geometry created a sophisticated sound transmission system. A noise at the lower gate traveled upward through carefully aligned corridors and resonant surfaces, effectively functioning as an early warning network centuries before electronic communication. For invading armies, this meant surprise became nearly impossible. Any force approaching the gates risked revealing its presence instantly. Guards stationed high above could mobilize defenders before attackers even reached the inner sectors. Combined with elevated artillery positions and overlapping defensive layers, Golconda transformed siege warfare into a brutal contest of attrition where the defenders always seemed one step ahead. The terrain surrounding the fortress amplified the danger. Massive granite boulders scattered across the landscape created natural choke points that funneled movement into predictable channels. Defenders positioned atop towers could observe enemy formations from miles away, while hidden cannon emplacements targeted advancing troops from elevated angles. Historical siege records suggest that even experienced commanders struggled to coordinate assaults effectively because communication between attacking units broke down under constant harassment from above. Inside the fortress lay an enormous self-sustaining military city. Reservoir carved into stone stored rainwater throughout the year. Granaries and armories occupied protected inner sectors. Secret tunnels reportedly connected parts of the fortress to nearby regions, allowing movement of supplies and personnel during prolonged siege conditions. Some accounts claim escape passages extended for miles beyond the visible perimeter, though portions remain unverified due to collapsed sectors and restricted excavation zones. Golconda's reputation grew further because of the wealth hidden behind its walls. The surrounding kingdom controlled major diamond trading networks, including mines that produce some of the world's most famous gems. This made the fortress both immensely desirable and extraordinarily dangerous to attack. Any prolonged siege threatened to drain enormous resources, while defenders remained protected behind one of the most advanced military complexes in India. Aurangzeb eventually captured Golconda after a prolonged campaign reportedly aided by internal betrayal rather than decisive battlefield superiority. Contemporary accounts suggest Mughal forces gained access after bribing individuals connected to the fortress gates. Even after breaching the defenses, the operation cost enormous manpower, time, and resources. Today, sections of Golconda's acoustic system still function. Tour guides demonstrate how sounds made at the lower gates travel upward through the fortress with eerie clarity. Military engineers studying the site continue debating how medieval architects achieved such precision without modern instruments. Golconda proved that the most feared fortresses are not always the tallest or strongest. Sometimes they are the ones that seem aware of your presence long before you ever touch the walls. The Sigiriya Rock Fortress. In the late 5th century AD, travelers moving through the jungles of central Sri Lanka began describing an impossible sight rising above the forests. Towering nearly 660 feet into the sky stood a colossal column of black stone with walls, gardens, and structures balanced upon its summit. From a distance, it appeared less like a fortress and more like a fragment of a mountain, torn from the earth and abandoned in isolation. Local guides warned visitors that armies approaching the rock rarely returned intact. The climb itself was deadly. The fortress above could see every movement for miles, and once attackers committed to the ascent, there was no retreat without exposing their backs to the defenders watching from the clouds. That fortress was Sigiriya. Built during the reign of King Kashyapa I, Sigiriya transformed a massive volcanic rock formation into one of the most extraordinary defensive complexes in ancient Asia. Unlike traditional fortresses that relied primarily on walls or towers, Sigiriya turned verticality itself into a weapon. The rock rose abruptly from otherwise flat jungle terrain, creating an isolated platform visible across vast distances. Any approaching army could be detected long before reaching the base. Archaeological surveys reveal that the fortress complex extended far beyond the summit. Elaborate water gardens, moats, defensive ramparts, and labyrinthine pathways surrounded the lower sectors of the site. These outer defenses forced attackers into narrow approach routes, exposed from multiple elevated positions. Double moats encircled parts of the fortress, while concealed trenches and stone barriers disrupted cavalry movement and siege engine deployment. But the true nightmare began at the climb. The ascent toward the summit passed through steep stairways carved directly into the rock face, many of them barely wide enough for small groups of soldiers at a time. Defenders stationed above possessed overwhelming tactical advantage. Arrows, stones, boiling liquids, and debris could be unleashed downward onto tightly compressed attackers, struggling for footing hundreds of feet above the ground. Even a small defending force could inflict catastrophic casualties against larger armies attempting frontal assault. At the midpoint of the climb stood the Lion Gate, an enormous stone entrance once shaped like a colossal lion emerging from the mountain itself. Visitors entering the upper fortress passed between gigantic carved paws, reinforcing the psychological dominance of the structure. Historical descriptions suggest the fortress was designed not only to resist invasion, but to intimidate anyone approaching it. Every stage of the ascent reminded attackers how vulnerable they had become. The summit itself functioned as a self-contained royal citadel. Excavations uncovered reservoirs, gardens, audience halls, storage chambers, and residential compounds integrated into the rocky plateau. Sophisticated hydraulic systems fed pools and fountains even during dry seasons, suggesting advanced water management technology far ahead of its era. Engineers studying the site continue debating how construction materials and supplies were transported to such elevation using ancient methods. Sigiriya's location amplified its defensive value. Thick jungle surrounding the rock complicated large-scale troop movement, while tropical heat and disease weakened invading forces before battle even began. Attackers unfamiliar with the terrain risked ambushes, supply disruption, and exhaustion long before reaching the fortress itself. Some historians believe Sigiriya was designed as much from paranoia as strategy. Kashyapa seized the throne through violent political conflict and reportedly feared retaliation from rival claimants. The fortress became both palace and sanctuary, engineered to make assassination or invasion nearly impossible. Chronicles describe the king observing the surrounding landscape from the summit, while hidden pathways allowed rapid movement between defensive sectors. Despite its immense advantages, Sigiriya was eventually abandoned after Kashyapa's death. Yet the reason may reveal the fortress's greatest weakness. A structure so dependent on centralized authority and elevated isolation became difficult to sustain politically once the ruler commanding it disappeared. Even the strongest fortress cannot survive forever without a kingdom willing to feed it. Modern aerial footage of Sigiriya remains unsettling. The rock still dominates the surrounding forests like an artificial mountain designed for war. Standing atop the summit today, the scale becomes painfully clear. Any army climbing toward those heights would have understood exactly why so many commanders hesitated before attempting attack. Sigiriya was not merely difficult to conquer. It forced invaders to climb directly into the sky while defenders waited above. The Montségur Fortress. In the winter of 1243, high in the frozen mountains of southern France, royal soldiers loyal to the French crown stared upward at a fortress perched on a narrow limestone peak known as a pog. Wind screamed across the cliffs with enough force to throw men from unstable ledges. Snow gathered along jagged paths barely wide enough for supply mules. Yet above the storm stood a stone citadel illuminated by torchlight, defiant against the darkness. The fortress had already resisted repeated pressure from the crown and the Catholic Church. Now, thousands of troops surrounded the mountain below, preparing for a siege many feared would become a slow death trap for both sides. That fortress was Montségur. Built atop a steep mountain rising nearly 4,000 feet above sea level in the Pyrenees, Montségur became the final major stronghold of the Cathars, a religious movement declared heretical during the Albigensian Crusade. Unlike massive imperial fortresses designed to project dominance across open terrain, Montségur relied on something far more dangerous: near total inaccessibility. The fortress sat atop a narrow rocky summit with sheer drops falling away on multiple sides. The ascent toward the stronghold followed steep switchbacks along exposed ridges where advancing troops could be observed for miles. Even small defending forces positioned above could halt much larger armies by targeting narrow choke points during the climb. Medieval chroniclers described attackers slipping from icy ledges, tumbling down cliffs before ever reaching the walls. The fortress itself was compact but brutally efficient. Stone ramparts followed the contours of the mountain, eliminating weak approach angles while maximizing visibility across surrounding valleys. Towers overlooked the only practical ascent route. Any siege engine hauled uphill faced enormous logistical difficulty. Heavy trebuchets required dismantling, transport across hazardous terrain, and reassembly under hostile observation. Winter weather worsened everything. Freezing temperatures, avalanches, and starvation threatened besieging armies as much as the defenders above. Archaeological investigations reveal that Montségur's inhabitants prepared carefully for prolonged isolation. Cisterns collected rainwater and snowmelt. Granaries stored preserved food supplies. Narrow internal chambers conserved heat during harsh winters. Excavators also uncovered evidence suggesting hidden storage areas carved into the mountain itself, possibly used to conceal valuables or religious texts during siege conditions. But Montségur's greatest power extended beyond military engineering. The fortress became a symbol. For the Cathars, it represented resistance against annihilation. For the French crown and the church, it represented defiance that could not be allowed to survive publicly. This transformed the siege into something larger than warfare. Destroying Montségur became a political necessity, even if the cost proved severe. Historical records describe the siege lasting approximately 10 months. Royal forces established camps around the mountain, slowly tightening control over surrounding access points. Yet direct assault remained extraordinarily dangerous. Defenders repeatedly exploited elevation advantages to repel attacks, while weather conditions weakened morale below. Some accounts suggest small groups of defenders navigated hidden mountain routes at night to maintain limited contact with sympathizers beyond the siege perimeter. Eventually, attackers succeeded in positioning siege equipment on a nearby ridge overlooking sections of the fortress. Under sustained pressure and facing dwindling resources, negotiations began. But even at the end, Montségur refused to collapse quietly. Historical sources recount that many Cathars chose death by fire rather than renounce their beliefs after surrender. Legends surrounding the fortress only deepened over time. Stories emerged claiming sacred relics escaped the mountain before its fall. Others suggested hidden tunnels beneath the Pog, concealed treasures, or forbidden manuscripts never recovered. Modern archaeological work remains limited by preservation concerns and difficult terrain, leaving many aspects of the fortress's internal structure unresolved. Standing at Montségur today still produces a disturbing realization. The mountain itself feels hostile to invasion. Every cliff edge, narrow path, and frozen ridge seems designed to exhaust and intimidate anyone attempting ascent. It is easy to understand why commanders feared attacking such a place directly. Montségur proved that a fortress does not always need massive walls to become terrifying. Sometimes all it needs is a mountain willing to fight beside it. The Kumbhalgarh Fort. In 1576, after the Battle of Haldighati shook the kingdoms of Rajasthan, Mughal scouts moving through the Aravalli Hills carried troubling reports back to Emperor Akbar's commanders. Rajput resistance had not collapsed as expected. Instead, surviving forces were retreating deeper into the mountains toward a fortress few invading armies had ever fully subdued. Veterans familiar with the region warned younger officers about what waited ahead. They spoke not of a castle, but of a stone barrier stretching across the hills, like a serpent coiled around the mountains. Some soldiers claimed the walls were visible for miles, even through desert haze. Others insisted the fortress was too vast to surround completely. When the Mughal columns finally reached the outer defenses, many understood why commanders throughout history had dreaded attacking Kumbhalgarh directly. Built during the 15th century under Rana Kumbha of Mewar, Kumbhalgarh Fort dominated the rugged terrain of western India with scale alone. Its defensive wall extended more than 22 miles through the mountains, making it one of the longest continuous fortification systems ever constructed. In some sectors, the walls measured nearly 15 feet thick, wide enough for multiple horsemen to ride side by side along the ramparts. Rather than enclosing a single structure, Kumbhalgarh protected an enormous fortified landscape containing palaces, military compounds, reservoirs, temples, farms, and entire defensive settlements hidden within the hills. The fortress was engineered around the natural chaos of the Aravalli Range. Sharp ridges, dense forests, and twisting valleys broke enemy formations before they ever reached the main gates. Approaching armies struggled to maneuver siege equipment through narrow mountain passes, while defenders monitored movement from elevated watchtowers positioned across interconnected peaks. At night, beacon systems allowed warnings to spread rapidly throughout the complex, making surprise assault nearly impossible. Kumbhalgarh's gates formed another layer of intimidation. Massive fortified entrances punctuated the winding ascent toward the inner citadel, each positioned at difficult angles that forced attackers to slow and compress into exposed corridors. Defensive towers above the gates created overlapping firing zones where archers and artillery crews could strike advancing troops from multiple elevations simultaneously. War elephants, often used to batter entrances elsewhere in India, found the uphill terrain exhausting and unstable. Yet the fortress's most frightening advantage was endurance. Unlike isolated castles dependent on external supply lines, Kumbhalgarh functioned almost like a hidden mountain kingdom. Reservoirs harvested rainwater across the hills. Fertile internal sectors supported agriculture. Storehouses contained grain reserves capable of sustaining prolonged resistance. Historical records indicate the fortress sheltered rulers, civilians, and military forces during periods of crisis precisely because it could continue operating even when surrounding regions collapsed into war. Several major powers attempted to capture Kumbhalgarh over the centuries, including the Delhi Sultanate, Gujarat Sultanate, and Mughal Empire. While temporary occupations occurred, direct conquest often required overwhelming alliances, internal betrayal, or prolonged campaigns designed to exhaust defenders gradually. Straightforward frontal assault against the full defensive system proved disastrously costly. The psychological effect of the walls themselves cannot be overstated. Travelers approaching Kumbhalgarh describe the sensation of encountering an artificial horizon carved into the mountains. The walls rose and disappeared across distant ridges, creating the impression that the fortress had no clear endpoint. For invading soldiers unfamiliar with the terrain, this scale generated uncertainty long before battle began. How many defenders waited behind the hills? How many hidden positions overlooked the valleys below? How long could the fortress survive isolation? Modern satellite imagery reveals just how intelligently the walls follow the contours of the mountains. Instead of fighting the terrain, the builders amplified it. Every ridge became a barrier, every valley became a funnel, every elevated point became a surveillance station. Military historians studying Kumbhalgarh often note that besieging the fortress would have required enormous manpower simply to maintain encirclement across such difficult geography. Even today, sections of the wall continue stretching across the hills in near silence, dwarfing the forests around them. The structure feels less like a fortress and more like a permanent military frontier etched into the landscape itself. Kumbhalgarh proved that the most terrifying strongholds are not always those hardest to breach. Sometimes they are the ones so immense that attacking them feels endless before the battle even begins. The Machu Picchu defensive complex. In 1536, as the Spanish conquest of the Inca Empire spread across the Andes, scattered reports began circulating among conquistador detachments about a hidden mountain stronghold beyond the reach of conventional armies. Indigenous guides spoke cautiously of stone structures suspended above the clouds, where narrow trails vanished into mist, and cliffs dropped thousands of feet into river gorges below. Some Spanish officers dismissed the stories as exaggeration meant to discourage pursuit. Others listened more carefully. The Andes had already consumed men, horses, and supply caravans without battle. Entire expeditions disappeared into the mountains, and somewhere within those peaks, there were whispers of a sanctuary no invading force could easily reach. That sanctuary was Machu Picchu, perched approximately 7,970 feet above sea level along a narrow ridge between towering Andean peaks. Machu Picchu occupied one of the most naturally defensible locations in the ancient world. Sheer cliffs surrounded much of the complex, plunging nearly 2,000 feet toward the Urubamba River below. Dense mountain fog rolled constantly across the ridge, reducing visibility and concealing movement. Even today, reaching the site requires traversing steep mountain paths, vulnerable to landslides, exposure, and exhaustion. For an invading army carrying armor, artillery, or cavalry equipment, the ascent would have bordered on suicidal. Unlike European fortresses dominated by massive outer walls, Machu Picchu relied on terrain integration so complete that the mountains themselves became the primary defense system. Narrow access trails twisted along cliff edges where only small groups could move at once. Defenders positioned above could easily observe approaching forces while remaining nearly impossible to flank. In many sectors, a single misstep during ascent meant fatal collapse into the ravines below. The engineering behind the complex intensified its defensive power. Stone terraces carved directly into the mountains stabilized the slopes against erosion, while simultaneously creating layered movement barriers. Precision-cut granite blocks fit together so tightly that even modern blades struggle to penetrate the seams. Many structures were built without mortar, allowing the stonework to flex during earthquakes without collapsing. This resilience enabled the settlement to survive in one of the most geologically unstable regions on Earth. Archaeological studies reveal that Machu Picchu maintains sophisticated water management systems, fed by mountain springs routed through stone canals and fountains. Agricultural terraces supported controlled food production despite the harsh elevation. Storage sectors protected grain and supplies from moisture and temperature extremes. Though historians continue debating whether Machu Picchu functioned primarily as royal estate, ceremonial center, or strategic refuge, its defensive advantages are undeniable. Spanish chroniclers never documented a direct assault against the site. In fact, there is no clear evidence that conquistadors ever discovered Machu Picchu during the height of conquest operations. This absence is deeply revealing. The Inca road system stretched across thousands of miles, yet certain mountain complexes remained effectively hidden by geography alone. The Andes themselves became a defensive labyrinth, where local knowledge mattered more than military strength. The surrounding environment amplified every danger for outsiders. High-altitude sickness weakened soldiers unaccustomed to thin air. Sudden storms transformed trails into death traps of mud and falling rock. Supply caravans moved painfully slowly across mountain routes, where pack animals struggled to maintain footing. Firearms and heavy armor offered limited advantage in terrain, where maneuverability determined survival. Modern aerial surveys show how carefully Machu Picchu was positioned between peaks that shielded it from direct observation. Dense vegetation concealed sections of the ridge, while cloud cover frequently obscured visibility entirely. Even standing within the complex today produces a strange sense of separation from the world below. The mountains isolate sound, the cliffs distort perspective. Every direction feels both beautiful and hostile. Some researchers argue the site was intentionally abandoned before Spanish expansion fully reached the region. Others suggest disease, political fragmentation, or strategic withdrawal emptied the complex. Yet one possibility remains difficult to ignore. Perhaps Machu Picchu survived precisely because no army wanted to gamble thousands of lives assaulting a fortress protected by the Andes themselves. Among all the strongholds across history, Machu Picchu may represent the purest example of a terrifying military truth. The most unconquerable fortress is not always the one with the strongest walls. Sometimes it is the one the enemy never dares to reach at all. Conclusion: these ancient fortresses reveal a disturbing pattern buried beneath the history of war. The greatest strongholds were not always the ones that won the most battles. Often, they were the ones that prevented battles from happening at all. Across deserts, mountains, cliffs, and narrow continental corridors, civilizations constructed fortresses so terrifying in position, scale, or engineering that invading armies hesitated before ever launching an assault. Derbent sealed entire migrations between Europe and Asia. The Theodosian Walls preserved Constantinople for nearly 1,000 years against wave after wave of empires. Alamut transformed fear itself into a defensive weapon. Kumbhalgarh became a mountain-sized barrier too vast to surround. And Machu Picchu disappeared into the Andes so completely that even conquerors who shattered empires failed to fully reach it. What makes these places so unsettling is not simply their military brilliance. It is the realization that geography, architecture, and psychology were fused together with terrifying precision long before modern warfare existed. These fortresses were not passive structures waiting to be attacked. They actively manipulated movement, exhausted supply lines, shattered morale, and forced enemy commanders into impossible calculations. Many of them were eventually abandoned, betrayed, or bypassed. Yet very few were truly conquered through direct strength alone. In several cases, deception, starvation, or political collapse succeeded where armies could not. That detail matters, because it suggests some fortresses achieved their ultimate purpose long before their walls ever fell. They changed the behavior of entire civilizations simply by existing. And perhaps the most haunting question is this: how many wars never happened because of these fortresses? How many invasions turned away before history ever recorded them? How many kingdoms survived centuries longer because somewhere above the clouds, behind the desert, or across the mountains, there stood a fortress no army wanted to attack? The ruins remain silent now, but their shadows may still stretch across the map of human history far more than we realize.